Thank you very much, Brother Winkler, for those very kind and very generous words. It's a great honor to be present this evening and during this lectureship to be associated with the great men of God who are here participating in the program, the great women of God, and those of you who are attending, and I just cannot express adequately my gratitude. I appreciate the outstanding work being done by the Brown Trail Road School of Preaching under the leadership of Brother Winkler and in connection with his faculty and the elders of the Brown Trail Road Church and everyone that has anything to do with the great work here at the School of Preaching. Now, I assure you that I shall not speak as long as the latecomer at church thought the preacher had been preaching. As he's being shown a back seat, he asked the usher, "How long has the preacher been preaching?" The usher replied, "Oh, about 40 years. And the man said he must be through by this time. And of course, I shall not speak, according to the assigned topic, as briefly as the boy who wrote an essay on Benjamin Franklin. He wrote that Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston. As a young man, he moved to Philadelphia, where he met a young woman whom he later married and then discovered electricity. I commend the Brother Winkler and the Lectureship Program Committee for having planned such an excellent program, with the exception of the present speaker. High commendation goes to the planning of this program by the selection of a very timely and a very important, much-needed subject. We're living in a time when the Bible is under attack. I guess that the most outstanding theme or topic or school of thought today in our United States is the authority of the Bible. If you'll pardon this personal reference, I studied in one of America's most eminent universities. They'd tell you what they felt the Bible taught, but they'd say, "What of it?" It was a book of the first century, not a book that's applicable to our lives here in the 20th century. And Brother Winkler, as you well know, the Old Testament is particularly under attack. And that you have planned to meet in large part these attacks is certainly very, very praiseworthy. Now, if I should choose text for this afternoon's study, I would have two chosen. The first would be Proverbs 30, verses 5 and 6. Every word of God is tried. He's a shield unto them that take refuge in him. Add thou not unto his words, lest he reprove thee, and thou be found a liar. The Bible has been under attack for centuries. It's been tried, it's been proved, and it's come out as a trustworthy and authoritative book. My second text would be in 1 Peter 3:15. But sanctify the Lord Jesus in your hearts, and be ready always to give answer to every man that asketh you a reason for the hope that lies within you, yet with meekness and fear. Now I shall address myself immediately to the assigned alleged contradictions, at least some of them, the ones assigned to me, upon the pages of the Old Testament. I wish I could have heard Brother Meadows this morning as he speaks somewhat on a parallel topic, but my work did not permit my arrival that early. But the first two verses are two areas which we should study. are Exodus 9, verses 3 and 6, and Exodus 14:9. Alleged critics of these say that there is a contradiction between Exodus 9 and Exodus 14. Well, let us look at the texts themselves, particularly in their historical milieu. But let us first read them. Behold, the hand of Jehovah is upon the cattle which are in the field, upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the herds, and upon the flocks. There will be a very grievous murrain. And all the cattle of Egypt died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel, not one died. In Exodus 14:9, which is also under attack, and the Egyptians pursued after them, that is, the Hebrews, all their horses and chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army. Some critics have seen a contradiction between the statement in verse 3 of chapter 9 that a very grievous murrain was visited upon the horses of Egypt by the hand of Jehovah, when Miriam was often resulted in death, and the statement in verse 9 of chapter 14, and all the Egyptians pursued after them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army. How could, they asked, the Egyptian horses pursue after the Hebrews if they had died in the pestilence of Murrin? Well, let us first of all call our attention to the fact, the statement that all the cattle died does not necessarily imply horses. Also, another fact is that the statement, all the horses, in Exodus 14:9, does not signify every horse. Totality is usually the biblical substitute for a high percentage. For example, in Matthew 3:5, then went out all unto him, Jerusalem, and all Judea, and all the region round about the Jordan. And they all certainly do not point to complete totality, but relativity. So in the application to the situation in Exodus to which we have referred, there were some horses that do not die, and the cattle, and they, of course, could have been in the army that pursued, the army of Pharaoh that pursued the Hebrews as they were escaping from the Egyptian bondage. And also the very expression of all cattle, as I've already indicated, does not necessarily imply horses. So when the facts are known, the statements that are affirmed to be contradictory are not contradictory, but they stand forth in all of their truthfulness and their non-contradictedness. Now, the second assignment is the affirmation made that there's a contradiction between Exodus 20 and verse 4 and Exodus 25, verses 18 to 20. Let us read Exodus 24 first, passage with which all of us are familiar. Thou shalt not make unto thee a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is under the earth. This is the second of the 10 commandments, which God through Moses gave unto the children of Israel. And not only that, gave unto the children of Israel who had come recently out of Egyptian bondage, where graven images denoted material representations of objects of worship by, of course, the Egyptians. The Israelites were to go into the land of Canaan, which God had promised them through their fathers. The Canaanites worshiped graven images made unto their gods. The Israelites might be tempted to do the same. Furthermore, we know that the prohibition of this commandment would assist the Hebrews to conceive of their God as incorporeal and as spiritual and not material, as their Canaanitish neighbors would conceive of their gods. It has been affirmed that Exodus 25, 18, and 20 is a contradiction of the commandment in Exodus 20, verse 4. The former verses read, that is Exodus 25, 18, and 20, "And thou shalt make the cherubim of gold, of beaten work shalt thou make them, at the ends of the mercy seat. And the cherubim shall spread out their wings on high, covering the mercy seat with their wings. With their faces one to another, toward the mercy seat shall the face or the faces of the cherubim be." There is therefore no contradiction with the command to make the cherubim of gold when the command is understood. The cherubim were placed at either end of the cover of the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, according to Exodus 25, 18 through 22 and Hebrews 9, 4. To protect the sacred objects which the ark housed, they were placed there as guardians of sacred things. The cherubim then were not graven images, but were of beaten work, made by the hammer, but not in the likeness of any created thing, as was the prohibition of Exodus 20, verse 4. The cherubim, therefore, were not to be worshipped. There is, therefore, no contradiction between Exodus 20 and 4 and Exodus 25, verses 18 through 20. We now move to the third claim in this study this afternoon, and that is the affirmation by some critics that the statements found in Leviticus 27, 28 and 29, and Deuteronomy 12, 30 and 31 are contradictory. Let us look again at them in their historical situations. Leviticus 27, 28, and 29 state, "Notwithstanding no devoted thing that a man shall devote unto Jehovah of all that he hath, whether of man or beast of the field of his possession, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy unto Jehovah. No one devoted that shall be devoted among men shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death." God is saying through Moses that no devoted thing unto Jehovah shall be sold or redeemed. The Hebrew for devoted is sherem, which meant an unredeemable grant to God. This relates to the most solemn vows. The devotee is not to fail in accomplishing his vow. The death penalty cannot be evaded. Verse 29 of the Authorized Version, the word is translated devoted, the Hebrew word, and shall be surely put to death, which may refer to capital punishment. The law stated in verses 28 and 29 has been employed by some critics to prove that human sacrifices were offered unto God at that time under the influence of the Canaanitish religions by the Hebrew peoples. But such a claim is not to be supported by facts. If God had commanded his people to offer human sacrifices, he would have so stated it explicitly. It is true the people of Canaan were devoted to destruction, but were not sacrifices to God. The cup of iniquity was full because of their gross idolatry and exceeding sinfulness. This was nothing or has nothing to do with human sacrifices by God's people, but only concerns the execution of the judgment or justice of God, rather. It has been affirmed that the foregoing instructions contradict those of Deuteronomy 12, verses 30 and 31, which read, "Take heed to thyself that thou be not ensnared to follow them. After that they are destroyed from before thee, and that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, How do these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. Thou shalt not do so unto Jehovah thy God, for every abomination to Jehovah which he hateth have they done unto their gods, for even their sons and their daughters do they burn in the fire unto their gods. The admonition expressed then in the foregoing verses was for the Hebrew people not to be influenced by the practice of propitiation to the gods of the Canaanites, even to the extent of burning their sons and daughters in the fire, to the gods of Canaan for protection and propitiation. The Hebrews might be tempted to go so far as to do this in their relation to Jehovah under the influence of their Canaanitish neighbors. So there is no contradiction between Leviticus 27, verses 28 and 29, and Deuteronomy 12, verses 30 and 31. The affirmation of the critics is weighed in the balances and is found entirely wanting. Moving now to the fourth consideration, the allegation by the critics that there's a contradiction between 2 Samuel 6:23 and 2 Samuel 21:8. 2 Samuel 6:23 reads, "And Michal the daughter of Saul had no child unto the day of her death." But in 2 Samuel 21:8 we read, "But for the king took the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul." Is there a contradiction here? 2 Samuel 6:23 says one thing, and on the surface it might seem that 2 Samuel 21:8 states another. Well, let us look at the facts. That Michal had no child unto the day of her death may signify had no child henceforward. Due to her despising David when the ark was returned to Jerusalem and he danced before it, with the abandon of decency and with conduct not becoming kingly honor. The relative to the 5 sons of Michal mentioned in 2 Samuel 21:3, or 21:8 rather, 2 Hebrew manuscripts in the Septuagint say that they were the sons of Merab, the sister of Michal, and that Michal reared them. Hebrew tradition supports the manuscripts and the rendition of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, with the addition of certain apocryphal books. The Targum adds whom Michal brought up, that is, these sons. Furthermore, 1 Samuel 18:19 states that it was Merab, the eldest daughter of Saul, who was given to Adriel the Meholavite as his wife. So in all the facts are gathered relative to Michal, we see that there is absolutely no contradiction. Now let us look at 2 Samuel, the 24th chapter, and compare it with 1 Chronicles 21:25. 2 Samuel 24:24 reads, "So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver." 1 Chronicles 21:25 says, "So David gave to Ornan for the place 600 shekels of gold by weight." Is there a contradiction between the 2 statements relative to that which David paid Ornan? The critics say there is. But what are the facts? Was it 50 shekels of silver or 600 shekels of gold by weight? Well, the answer is very, very simple. In 2 Samuel 24:24, David purchases for 50 shekels of silver the floor, the oxen and blood instruments, whereas the price only for 600 shekels given in 1 Chronicles 21:25 was later for the whole area whereon the temple was to be built later. Again, the Word of God, having been tried, comes forth refined as pure fire. And there is absolutely no contradiction. Now let us turn in the sixth place to 1 Kings, the 8th chapter and the 9th verse, where the critics say that what it says is contradictory to what Hebrews 9:4 states. Well, let us look at 1 Kings 8:9. There was nothing in the ark save the 2 tables of stone which Moses put there at Horeb, when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. Hebrews 9 verses 3 and 4 read, "And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the Holy of Holies, having a golden altar of incense, and the ark of the covenant overlaid round about with gold, wherein was a golden pot holding the manna, and Aaron's rod that budded in the tables of the covenant." Now the question, what really constituted the contents of the ark? One view is that nothing was ever in the ark but the 2 tables of stone placed there by Moses, according to Exodus 25, verse 21, and Exodus 40, verse 20, and Deuteronomy, the 10th chapter, and the 2nd verse. Now the articles mentioned in Hebrews 9:4 were not in the ark, as some have claimed, but by the side of it, before the testimony, according to Exodus 16:33 and Numbers 17:10. Another view is that Hebrews 9:4 contains the facts at a later time when these other items were present. The writer of this paper and your speaker accepts the last view. There is, however, or therefore, no contradiction between 1 Kings 8:9 and Hebrews 9:4. Now let us move to the 7th accusation of a contradiction between 1 Kings 15:14 and 2 Chronicles 14, verses 3 through 5. 1 Kings 15:14 states, "But the high places were not removed. Nevertheless, Asa's heart was perfect all his days." 2 Chronicles 14:3 and 5 read, "For he, Asa, took away the foreign altars and the high places, and brake down the pillars, and hewed down the Asherim." 1 Kings 15:14 states that Asa did not remove the high places. And 2 Chronicles 14 3 through 5 indicate that he did. Which is correct? Or are both of them? Kyle, in his monumental commentary in the Kyle Daily Series, Kyle's commentary on 1 Kings says that chapter 15, verse 14, implies that Asa was unsuccessful in carrying out completely his reforms. The king did his part, but the people continued to worship at the high places, and thus these places were not removed. Rawlinson, in his commentary upon Kings, believes that the foregoing texts refer to different times in the reign of Asa. In the early years he put down idolatry, but in his late years he permitted idolatrous worship to creep in when his character had deteriorated. See 2 Chronicles 16, verses 7 through 10. The implication of Kyle on 1 Kings 15:14 could be true, but your scribe agrees with Rawlinson on the 2 texts of Kings and Chronicles. That is, that there were 2 periods in the life of Asa. Now let us turn to the 8th section of our study, in which we are concerned with Deuteronomy 32:4, versing as claimed Amos the 3rd chapter and the 6th verse. Deuteronomy 32:4 states the rock, his work, of course the rock referring to God or Christ or both, his work is perfected, all his ways of justice, of God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and right is he. But Amos 3:6 says, shall evil befall a city, and Jehovah hath not done it? Now, is there a contradiction between Deuteronomy 32:4 and Amos 3:6? Well, let us look at the two statements in Deuteronomy and in Amos, or the statement in each. First, God is faithful. He is true to his revealed character and to his promises. He is without iniquity. It is impossible for God to do wrong. Just and right is he. The Hebrew language here indicates that all of God's ways are just and right in his dealings with his creatures, especially with human beings. Amos 3:6 reads, shall the trumpet be blown in a city and the people not be afraid? Shall evil befall a city, and Jehovah hath not done it? Now here is a statement and a question which some people believe to be contradictory. How can God be faithful without iniquity, just and right, and visit evil upon a city? What did Amos have in mind in evil befalling a city at the hands of God? Amos believed that evil, which is sin, was done by the Israelites and not by God. It was this evil which was brought upon Bethel, where Amos is temporarily preaching. Augustine expressed it in these words, quote, evil which is sin, the Lord hath not done. Evil which is punishment for evil, the Lord bringeth. The revelation of the divine purpose of God is seen in the deluge, in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and other acts of God. There is therefore no contradiction between God being faithful, without iniquity, justice and right, and his visitation of evil upon the people of a city who deserved it by their sins. Now let us move to the 9th section, Judges 1:19 versus Matthew 19:26. Is God omnipotent or is he not? Judges 1:19 reads, and Jehovah was with Judah, and he drove out the inhabitants of the hill country, for he could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. In a far different context, and centuries later, Matthew 19:26 reads, and Jesus looking upon them said to them, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Let us therefore look at these two statements and see if there's a contradiction between them and if God is omnipotent. The inspired writer of Judges informs us that Jehovah could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley. But Matthew records that Jesus said, with God all things are possible. Are then Judges 1:19 and Matthew 19:26 contradictory? Is God omnipotent or is he not? The first of these two questions is answered, of course, in the affirmative. But the pronoun he in Judges 1:19 refers to the nearest antecedent, which is Judah, who could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron. The scripture in Judges does not say that Jehovah was with Judah. It does not state that his being with him would enable him to drive out the inhabitants of the valley. This does not signify the inability of Jehovah but the way in which he worked and works. Jesus stated, as recorded in Matthew 19:26, that all things are possible with God. Yet the author of the book of Hebrews says that it's impossible for God to lie. Hebrews 6:18. How are these seemingly contradictory statements to be understood? They are comprehended in the light of the character and nature of God. It is not in accord with his character and nature to have caused his people to win over their enemies in the valley who had chariots of iron. God is omnipotent. He is on his throne, ruling in the heavens. He always has the last word. His omnipotence does not employ the power to do everything, but to do everything which is the correct object of his power. God can do what man cannot do. He can speak of a possible, or we can speak of a possible impossibility. Hence again, there is no contradiction between Judges 1:19 and Matthew 19:26. Now let us look at our final assignment, so far as Scriptures are concerned, this paper. Numbers 25:9 versus 1 Corinthians 10:8, so the critics affirm. Numbers 25:9 states, and those that died by the plague were 20 and 4,000. 1 Corinthians 10:8 reads, neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed and fell in one day 3 and 20,000. How many died then in the plague? 24 or 23,000. Some manuscripts and versions, particularly the latter Syriac and Armenian, have 24,000, as does the Hebrew text. In Numbers 25:4, God orders Moses to take all the heads of the people and hang them up before the Lord against the sun. These heads could well have numbered 1,000. Those who fell by the plague were 23,000, make a total of 24,000. Another view of the matter is that 24,000 died in the plague according to Moses, and that Paul referred to those who died in one day. Either of these two explanations seems plausible. Whichever is correct, however, there is absolutely no contradiction between the statement of Moses and that of Paul. Of the 10 alleged contradictions in the Old Testament studied in this paper, none is contradictory. When they are studied in the light of their historic situations, when all the facts are known, they are in perfect harmony. This is true because they are of God, and God is non-contradictory and entirely harmonious in character. I wish to say briefly a final word that covers the whole paper and all of the papers that will be presented along this line in this great lectureship. I intended to state at the outside, at the beginning of my sharing this talk with you, that my stance in this whole matter is that the Bible is absolutely infallible and entirely inerrant. But there's not a single contradiction from Genesis 1:1 through Revelation 22:22. Now the problem is that people do not study the problem with those who feel the contradictions. The Scriptures that may on the surface appear to be somewhat contradictory in the light of the historical situations out of which the Scriptures come. The Bible abundantly testifies to its infallibility. Ye shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall it diminish therefrom. If Moses had not believed in the entire infallibility of the Pentateuch and all the Bible, as far as that's concerned, he would not have made this admonition. We've already quoted Proverbs 35:6. In 2 John 9, whosoever goeth onward and abideth not in the teaching of Christ hath not God. But whoso abideth in the teaching, the same hath both the Father and the Son. Then the last admonition, if any man adds unto the words of the book of this prophecy, God will add the plagues that are written. If any man takes away from them, God will take away his part from the tree of life and out of the holy city. Now, you don't say this, but you may have friends who say, whenever preachers of the gospel quote these passages, they're quoting from the Bible itself to prove that the Bible is infallible and inerrant. Well, that's legitimate, because the witness is qualified from every standpoint of the witnesses. But I want to take a further minute to tell you just a little about archaeology. Time was when they said Moses could not have written the Pentateuch because there was no writing in the time of Moses. But the discovery of the Telemarinara letters and the Mel Meritath inscription in ancient Egypt forever disprove that allegation. Not only was there writing in the time of Moses, but there was high literacy. In 1929, a Syrian farmer with his plowshare uncovered a great discovery which is later known as the Rosh Hashanah tablets, which threw a flood of light upon the books of Kings and Chronicles, which had been questioned as to their authenticity. In 1947, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls have thrown a flood of light, of information upon the Old and New Testaments. It was my privilege in other years to study under Dr. William Foxwell Albright, who did more than any single man to establish credence in the Bible, that is, more than any man across the great board of Europe and the United States and the Middle East and so on. He was the world's unsurpassed archaeologist. As a young professor in a prestigious American university, he made his first trip to Bible lands to do archaeological work. On his way, he stopped at the famous École Biblique in Jerusalem and spoke to the faculty and to the student body. Among other things, he said, "Gentlemen, there are contradictions in the Bible. I know that, and you know it, especially in the Old Testament. But I am very interested in archaeology, and I'm on my way to the Mesopotamian Valley to dig." Professor Albright returned in about 2 years and addressed the same faculty at the École Biblique and largely the same student body, among other things holding in his hands findings from the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. He said, "Gentlemen, 2 years ago, I made the statement here that there are errors in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. But I'm here to tell you today that a man who says there are errors in the Bible is either uninformed or an absolute ignoramus." Now, that is the testimony of archaeology. The Bible is sufficient testifying for itself. But I want that which has been instilled in the students of this great school of preaching to reinstill, if possible, into these young men complete confidence in the absolute harmony, in the complete accuracy of the entire Bible. You and I may not understand passages, but it's our reflection on us and not upon the Lord who gave them to us. And may God bless us as we continue to study this great book, which is without contradiction in its teachings.